When does consciousness begin? Here's a scene almost every parent remembers. You're holding your newborn, you're exhausted, you're staring into two dark, unfocused eyes, and you find yourself asking the oldest question in the nursery: is anybody home in there? For decades, the honest, scientific answer was a shrug. Babies can't tell us what they're experiencing, so researchers had to get creative. They had to find the fingerprints consciousness leaves behind, even when the person having the experience can't describe it. Think of it like being a detective at a crime scene where the witness can't talk. You can't ask the newborn, "Did you see that face on the screen?" So neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene and Ghislaine Dehaene-Lamberts in France went looking for a specific brain signature, a delayed electrical aha wave that shows up in adults about a third of a second after we consciously notice something. It's called the P300, and it's basically the brain's way of saying, "Yes, I registered that." In 2013, and in follow-up work refined more recently, their team put soft electrode caps on babies, 5 months old, 1 year old, and 15-month-olds, and flashed faces on a screen for varying lengths of time, some too brief to register, and some longer. What they found was remarkable. Even the 5-month-olds showed a version of that aha wave. It was slower and fainter than in older children, like a radio signal picked up from farther away. But it was there. The conclusion? Babies as young as 5 months appear to have some form of conscious visual experience. But here's where it gets even more interesting. A growing group of researchers now think consciousness might start even earlier than that, possibly before birth. A 2025 review in the journal Acta Pediatrica by the Swedish neonatologist Hugo Lagerkrantz makes the case that consciousness isn't a light switch that flips on at some magic moment. It's more like a sunrise, gradual, with degrees of brightness. His research suggests a fetus may show early flickers of awareness after about 24 weeks of gestation, mostly while asleep in the womb. Then birth itself is like a jolt of coffee for the brain. The first breath and the flood of sensory stimulation, cold air, bright light, being touched and handled, activates an ancient alerting system deep in the brainstem, and newborns arrive already able to recognize their mother's voice, her smell, and her face. I have a later episode coming up about how learning actually does occur in utero. Scientists actually disagree on where exactly to draw the line, and in early 2025, a whole conference at NYU was dedicated to fighting this out. It was literally called the Infant Consciousness Conference. Some researchers hold what's called the late onset view. They think real consciousness requires more sophisticated thinking abilities that don't show up until closer to a baby's first birthday. Others hold the early onset view, that a simpler, more basic form of awareness, sometimes just called primary consciousness, the raw feeling of this moment, this sensation, is present from birth or even before. Interestingly, when that same NYU audience of consciousness researchers was polled, on when they personally thought consciousness begins. A meaningful slice picked the later prenatal period, while some picked early infancy. So think of consciousness less like a birthday and more like a dimmer switch that someone is slowly turning up, starting sometime in the third trimester and continuing for years afterward. Which brings us to the second half of this question. At what age are we the most conscious? You might assume more is always better, that a fully loaded adult brain stuffed with decades of memory and vocabulary must be the peak of awareness. But many consciousness researchers actually flip this expectation on its head. Think about how a young child experiences a simple bubble bath, or their first trip to the beach. Totally absorbed, wide-eyed, undistracted by yesterday's to-do list or tomorrow's meetings. Some scientists argue that in terms of raw, present moment sensory awareness, what's sometimes called primary consciousness, young children may actually be more immersed in the here and now than adults are, precisely because they haven't yet built the dense scaffolding of memory, self-narrative, and future planning that adult brains constantly run in the background. What adults gain in self-reflective, I know that I know consciousness, they may trade away in sheer moment-to-moment vividness. It's a bit like the difference between watching a sunset and simultaneously trying to photograph it, caption it, and remember where you parked. The child is just watching the sunset. If you haven't already seen my episodes on consciousness called What is Awareness, or the episode Are Animals Conscious?, you might want to check them out. And don't forget to keep growing, keep learning, and keep blossoming. Thank you.